Deciding what size piece of fabric to cut for your new cross-stitch project can seem like a really daunting thing. Because what if you get it wrong? And how do you even know how much you need anyway? Well, I'm going to walk you through a few simple steps so you can get it right every single time without cutting your fabric too small or without wasting any. Hello there, my stitchy friends. I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can get the most joy from your cross stitching. Now, I absolutely know the anxiety of cutting into a piece of fabric and hoping I've done my calculations correctly and that I'm going to get the right size piece of fabric for my cross stitch project. It never really gets any easier. But I do like to follow the same simple step-by-step process, the same calculations every time so that I can be as sure as I possibly can be that I've got the fabric size correct. I'm going to take you through this process, and I've also got a handy guide / worksheet that you can use to help you, so I'll make sure that's linked in the description, so grab that. It's also a really useful summary of everything that I'm going to talk about today. Now, of course, if you're working with a kit, then the fabric will be provided for you and you'll be good to go. But you also might choose not to use fabric in the kit, and you might want to use your own fabric, so you would still then have to calculate the size. Or even if you are going to use the fabric from the kit, you might want to just check the margins are going to be sufficient for how you want to finish the project when it's completed. But more on that later. And first, let's dive into some calculations. So the first question is, how big will your completed stitching be? Now, this might sound a bit obvious, but you do need to know how big your completed stitching is going to be when it's finished. And this will be entirely dependent on the count of fabric that you're using. Now, hopefully you'll be able to find this information easily available from your pattern. But if it isn't, then you can calculate this yourself with an online calculator or on the worksheet that I've designed. I also have a video that goes into more detail about what fabric count is and why it's helpful to know. So I'll link that in a card and in the description. So I'm going to be using this pattern as an example, and it is one of my own, which is available to buy in my Etsy shop if you're interested. So I will pop a link in the description for you. Now, my patterns will all show you what the stitch count will be and what the design size would be on different counts of fabric. But we are also going to look at what happens if you don't have the information on the sizes. This is the guide and worksheet that I've created, and it will walk you through all the steps you need to find out how big a piece of fabric you'll need for your cross-stitch project. So it is on 3 pages, and we'll have a look at all of those parts so that you can see exactly how to use it. So the first part we're looking at is what fabric you're using to stitch on. So for the dragon example here, I stitched this on 16 count Aida. So for Aida, your fabric type, you would always be stitching over 1 thread of fabric, and my fabric count was 16. So I'll pop that in the box there. And then I'm going to use the same fabric count in my calculations below. So I'll write 16 again here. Now, if I was stitching, for example, on even weave, and again stitching over 1, so say I'm using 25 count even weave, that would be the same line here, but I would write 25 and carry that over 25. Now, if I'm going to use even weave or linen, but I'm stitching over 2 threads of fabric, so for example, if I'm using 28 count even weave, then I'll write 28 in here, but then I'm going to divide that by 2 to use for my calculations. So that would give me 14. Now, if I have completely lost you with talking about stitching over 1 and over 2, then pause this video, hop on over to my super quick video explaining this. Again, I'll add a card and a link in the description. And when you've watched that, come on back here. So step 2 is looking at how big is your design going to be when it's finished being stitched. So for my pattern, I can read that information off of here, and I can see it's going to be 65 high by 40 wide. And I can then, if I was using my pattern, I could read off the size, the stitch design size on my chosen fabric count straight from the pattern here. So let's take 16 count Ada, again, 6.3 by 10.3. So 10.3 centimetres by 6.3 centimetres. Now, if you've got this information with the size, you can skip straight to step 3. You don't really need to do any more calculations. You can go straight to working out step 3. But if for some reason you didn't have this, we can use these numbers here to work it out. And that's what this part of the worksheet is for here. So let's calculate the design size based on the 16 count Ada that I stitched my dragon on. So I need my stitch count for the height, which is here, so that's 65. And then I need my fabric count that I was going to use. I was going to use 16 for my 16 count Ada. So my fabric count is 16. And that would give me 65 divided by 16 is 2.5 inches. And if I want to convert that to centimetres, multiply by 2.54, which gives me 6.35 centimetres. And it's exactly the same for the width, which was 40. So 40 divided by 16 gives me 4.1 inches. And I can convert that to centimetres, which is 10.3. Which fortunately is the same as what was on my pattern earlier. Phew. So now you know how big your completed stitching will be. The final step is to decide how much extra you want to add around the design. So the margins that you want to add to give you the final size of fabric that you're going to need. And it's not always a simple case of taking the stitch design size and adding the same amount on each side. If I did that for this dragon design, then I would be cutting a piece of fabric that is rectangular, because I'd add the same to the top and bottom and the same amount to the side. And that might not be any good if I wanted to put it in a square frame or an embroidery hoop. So the most important consideration for how much margin to leave is how you want to finish the project. Now, you might well not know upfront how you want to finish it, in which case I would just leave the largest amounts recommended so that you won't be caught short. So your worksheet gives you a few things to consider, such as the one we've just talked about, as whether you want to finish your design, it's going to have the same proportions, so the same amount of margins on each side, or if your finished display area is going to be square, so you'll want the same width and height on your piece of fabric. You might also like to consider the practicalities of the size of fabric, so you've got a good enough size of fabric to be able to hold if you stitch in hand, or to put into an embroidery hoop, Q-snap, or any other kind of frame if you want to be able to use one of those while you're stitching. And in this case, I would generally cut the fabric to the size of the hoop or frame that you're going to be using while you're stitching, and you might just have to accept that you will have bigger margins than you actually need to finish the project, which is really only a problem if you don't love the waste aspect to this. And finally, you might consider that you might want more fabric visible around your design. Perhaps if you've got a really nice fancy fabric and you want a bit more of that on show when you finish it, then you may need to add a little bit extra to your margins to allow for that. So then the worksheet has recommendations for how much margin to add, depending on how you're going to finish the project. So I'm going to walk you through pretty much all of these different examples so that you can see exactly what I mean. And I'll use the dragon pattern each time so that you can see the differences between the different finishing methods. So I will be referring to this table. I'm not going to bring it out and show it every time, but it's there for you to refer to, and it will give you the way you want to finish, the base dimensions, the margin on each side, and the total margin that you would need to add. So the final bit on the guide is the step where you can write down what base height and width you're using, what your chosen total margin is, and therefore your final fabric size. So the first way that you might want to finish your design is in an embroidery hoop. And for this, I would look at the size that my finished piece will be, choose a hoop that it will fit into, and then cut my fabric size based off the hoop size and not the design size. So my stitching is 6.3 by 10.3 centimetres. So I've picked a 13 centimetre hoop. And don't forget, when you're measuring your hoop, you're going to measure from where the two parts of the hoop meet. So from here to here. And that's 13 centimetres. So my base height is going to be 13 centimetres and my base width is going to be 13 centimetres. And then I'll look at the table and look at the chosen margins. Now the table suggests a total of 10 centimetres on both the height and the width, so that's 5 centimetres either side. And that gives me a final fabric size of 23 centimetres. So to stitch this design and finish it in a hoop, I want 23 centimetres squared of fabric. So the second example I have for you is if you want to frame it in a square frame. Now this could be you framing it yourself, or it could be that you're taking it to a professional framer. Now since we want the finished piece to be square, I would use whichever is biggest of the height and width and use that for both of my base dimensions. So the height is the biggest at 10.3. So I'm going to use that for both my base height and width. And then the margin total for framing either yourself or professionally, I would suggest a total of 20 centimetres. So I'm going to add 20 centimetres to both the height and the width. And I can do a little bit of rounding here because it's going to be a fairly decent size of fabric. So I can go for 30 centimetres. So 30 centimetres of fabric would be perfect for framing, because you need to give enough margins when you're framing to be able to stretch the fabric around the mount board. So this is generally the largest amount of fabric margin that you would ever really need to leave. Now, this is also where you need to bear in mind if that will give you enough margins, if you particularly want an especially large amount of fabric on show around your design. So if for this design, for example, I wanted to have the visible fabric area be 20 centimetres squared, now that would only give me 10 centimetres of margin. That's 5 centimetres on each side. Now, I think most framers would appreciate a little bit more than this to work with, and you probably would yourself if you're framing it yourself. So you might add an extra 10 centimetres to this and cut 40 centimetres square so that you've got enough for the fabric on show and to do the mounting. So the third way that you might want to finish your design is to make it into a greeting card with an aperture, like one of these. And here again, I would look at the stitch design size, choose an aperture that the design will fit into, and then I would use the aperture as my base dimensions. And again, if it's a round aperture, then you want to use the biggest of the height and width to work off as your base height and width. So this little chap here, say his biggest dimension was 10.3 centimetres. So I might choose to put him in a 12 centimetre round aperture. So my base dimensions will be 12 centimetres in both directions. And for a greeting card, I would suggest adding, you don't need a huge amount, probably about 8 centimetres is fine. So 8 centimetres, so I'm going to have 20 centimetres square. So cutting 20 centimetres square would give me plenty to finish this in a greeting card with a round aperture. Now, if you were going to use the design in an aperture that was rectangular rather than circular, then you could use the exact dimensions of the aperture. Obviously, this design, the aperture would be that way round, but you could use those exact dimensions as your base dimensions and add the same 8 centimetres of total margin. So the rectangular aperture that you'd need for this would be, say, an 8 by 12 centimetre aperture, and you'd add that total margin of 8 centimetres to give you a fabric size of 16 by 20 centimetres. And the fourth way you might be finishing your project is by making a patch. So this is where you cut fairly close around the design and fray the edges. And again, this could be in the same proportions as the design, like this one, or it could be squared off, like this one. So for this, you're going to use your stitched design size as your base dimensions. And for a squared off finish, you'll want to use the biggest of the height or width. And for an in proportion finish like this, you could use the exact stitch dimensions. Now, this is where you can get away with the very smallest margins, because you're not going to need much when you finish it. And I've recommended adding a total of just 6 centimetres. So if I was doing this for the dragon as an in proportion finish, so it would end up rectangular, then I would use the stitched design size. So I've got 10.3 centimetres by 6.3 centimetres. My total margin of 6 centimetres. So that's going to give me 16.3 centimetres and 12.3 centimetres. And in this case, I'd probably round those up very slightly to 16.5 by 12.5 because it is already quite a small piece of fabric. And this is where you can also decide if that's going to be physically big enough for you to stitch on, or if you need your fabric to be a bit bigger than that for practicalities. So for example, if you wanted to stitch this in a Q-snap frame, where the smallest size is 15 centimetres square, this fabric size wouldn't fit in there. So you would work this out, but then decide to use bigger so that it will fit into the frame that you want to use while you're stitching. Now I realise this won't have been a completely comprehensive overview of all the different ways that you could possibly finish your cross-stitch project, but I hope that going through those different examples will help you understand how to calculate how much fabric you need, and you can use that and adapt it to whatever you're going to be making. One final tip I have for you is that having carefully calculated how much fabric you need, make sure that you don't lose any of that edge to fraying as you stitch. And I've made a video on 5 ways that you can stop your fabric edges fraying, so I'll link that in a card and the description for you if you think you'd find that useful. I hope that's broken the process down for you so that you can be super confident about calculating the size of fabric you need for your next cross-stitch project. And of course, don't forget to grab your worksheet from the description below. If you found this video helpful, then please do give it a thumbs up, and I'd love for you to subscribe so you don't miss any of the future tips and tutorials that I'll be sharing. Thank you so much for watching, and happy stitching!